There are versions of ourselves we only recognize in hindsight. The girl I was when I met Elliot Cross is one I understand now, but didn't then. I was open in a way that felt brave, not naive, soft without apology. I believed honesty was a strength and that people, given enough clarity, would meet you at the same depth you offered them. I didn't think that made me fragile. I thought it made me evolved. That belief is what he noticed first. We met at a networking event I hadn't even wanted to attend. Nina had practically dragged me there, promising free wine and connections that might actually matter. The room was full of polished smiles and conversations that felt like performances. I stood near the back, sipping too slowly, watching people sell curated versions of themselves. That's when Elliot approached me. He didn't interrupt. He waited. That alone set him apart. "You look like you're observing more than participating," he said, his tone curious, not invasive. I smiled. "I'm deciding if it's worth participating." He laughed, not loudly, not for attention, just enough to feel genuine. "I had the same debate," he said. "Observation usually tells you more." We talked like that at first, about patterns, about people, about how exhausting it is to be impressive all the time. He didn't flirt aggressively. He didn't dominate the conversation. He asked questions and listened like the answers mattered. That should have been the first warning. But when someone seems to see you, really see you, it feels rare, valuable, safe. Elliot was respected in the room. I could tell by the way others subtly angled toward him, by how his name landed with recognition. He had that quiet authority people trust without knowing why. When someone joined our conversation, he introduced me with care, like my presence reflected well on him. "This is Mara," he said. "She notices things most people miss." I felt a small spark of pride. Not because of him, but because he articulated something about me I hadn't known how to say out loud. We exchanged numbers casually. No pressure, no dramatic exit, just an easy promise to continue a conversation that felt unfinished. Our first coffee happened 3 days later. He arrived early. Another detail that felt intentional. We talked for hours, about childhood, about ambition, about the moments that quietly shape who you become. He shared selectively, not enough to overshare, not enough to stay distant. A balance that felt mature. When I spoke, he never rushed me. When I hesitated, he waited. "You don't have to explain," he said once when I stopped mid-sentence. "I get it." I believed him. Over the next few weeks, Elliot became a presence. Not overwhelming, not absent. Consistent. Texts that checked in without demanding. Invitations that respected my schedule. Compliments that focused on my mind more than my appearance. "You're dangerous in the best way," he told me once. "You think deeply." I laughed it off, but part of me stored the comment somewhere warm. I didn't notice how often he mirrored my language, how easily he aligned his values with mine, how naturally he positioned himself as someone who understood me better than most. People say manipulation is obvious in hindsight. It is. It's subtle, comfortable, familiar. The first time something felt off, it was so small I almost missed it. We were at dinner with a few of his colleagues. The conversation turned to a project I'd been involved in, one I was proud of. I began to explain my role when Elliot gently placed a hand on my arm. "She's being modest," he said to the table. "Mara tends to downplay her contributions." Everyone smiled. Someone joked. The moment passed. But I hadn't been downplaying anything. I'd been speaking clearly. Later, I told myself he'd meant well, that he was protecting me from sounding arrogant, that maybe I had been minimizing myself without realizing it. That's the thing about the version of me he met. She always checked herself first. As weeks turned into months, Elliot's world began to overlap with mine. Friends, workspaces, events. It felt natural, like growth, not invasion. When he spoke about me, it was always positively. Publicly supportive, privately corrective. "You're coming across a bit intense," he'd say gently after a meeting. "You might want to soften that point, it can intimidate people." I worry they don't always understand your tone. He framed everything as concern, and I listened because I trusted him. Nina didn't. "I don't know," she said one night, after meeting him for the third time. "Something about him feels managed." "Managed how?" I asked, like he's always 3 steps ahead of the room. I defended him immediately, explained his background, his experience, his thoughtfulness. Nina dropped it, but not without a look that lingered. The truth is, Elliot never raised his voice, never insulted me directly, never told me what to do. He didn't have to. He created an environment where I started editing myself automatically, where I wondered how my words would land through his lens, where I measured my reactions against what he might say later. And because he was never cruel, I couldn't name the discomfort. By the time I realized how much of myself I'd adjusted, it felt too late to ask when it started. The version of me he met was trusting, reflective, willing to believe people meant what they said. She thought being understood was the same as being respected. I know better now. But at the beginning, sitting across from him in that cafe, laughing too easily, believing too fully, I couldn't imagine how quickly perception could become a weapon, or how quietly someone could begin rewriting you without ever touching the page. That version of me didn't know she was being studied. She thought she was being chosen. The first lie I ignored. The first lie didn't arrive loudly. It didn't demand attention or trigger alarms. It slipped in quietly, dressed as reason, wrapped in familiarity. If I'm honest, it didn't even come from Elliot at first. It came from me. We were 3 months in when it happened, far enough along that routines had formed, but early enough that everything still felt flexible. I knew his coffee order. He knew which silences meant I was thinking versus retreating. We hadn't said love yet, but we behaved like people circling it carefully, deliberately. That night, he invited me to a small gathering at his place. Nothing formal. A few colleagues, some friends. He framed it as low pressure, something easy. "You'll like them," he said. "They're sharp, curious, not performative." That description mattered to me. I didn't like rooms where I had to audition. When we arrived, I noticed how naturally Elliot moved through the space. He wasn't hosting in the traditional sense, no loud welcomes, no hovering, but people deferred to him, asked his opinion, waited for his reaction. I stood slightly behind him at first, observing. Someone brought up a recent professional decision Elliot had made, one that had been controversial in certain circles. I'd heard about it from him before. He deframed it as necessary, strategic. "You had to be ruthless," one man said. "Most people wouldn't have the nerve." Elliot smiled modestly. It wasn't about nerve, it was about clarity. I nodded instinctively. Then someone asked, "What do you think, Mara?" I answered honestly. I spoke about ethical trade-offs, about long-term consequences, about how decisiveness can be both strength and liability. I wasn't critical. I wasn't aggressive. I was thoughtful. Elliot didn't interrupt, but he didn't agree either. Instead, he laughed lightly. "This is why I love her perspective. She sees all the angles." The comment landed well. Compliments usually do. Still, something in me tightened. Later, in the kitchen, while he poured drinks, I mentioned it. "I thought we talked about that decision differently before." He didn't hesitate. We did. So this wasn't the space for nuance," he said calmly. "People hear uncertainty as weakness." I wasn't uncertain. He looked at me, eyes steady. "You didn't sound confident." There it was, the smallest fracture. I searched my memory, replayed my words, my tone. Had I hesitated? Had I softened a point unconsciously? Maybe. "I just don't want you misrepresented," he added. "People can be unforgiving." Concern, always concern. I nodded, even though something inside me resisted. It wasn't anger, it was confusion. A quiet misalignment between how I experienced myself and how he described me. That night, lying beside him, I told myself I was being sensitive, that I wasn't used to navigating spaces like his, that he understood dynamics I didn't yet. That was the first lie. Over the next few weeks, it happened again in different shapes. I'd tell a story, and he'd gently correct a detail. I'd express frustration, and he'd reframe it as stress. I'd assert a boundary, and he'd interpret it as fear. Each time, he sounded reasonable. Calm, certain. "You might not realize how it comes across. I know you don't mean it that way. I'm just trying to help you protect yourself." And every time, I questioned my own perception. I started replaying conversations in my head before speaking, editing thoughts mid-sentence, adjusting phrasing so it wouldn't be misunderstood. Not by others, by him. Nina noticed before I did. "You hesitate now," she said one afternoon as we sat in a cafe, the kind with chipped mugs and no pretense. "You used to just say things." "I'm just more aware," I replied. She raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" I didn't have an answer that didn't sound defensive. "He's good for you," I added quickly. "He challenges me." "Does he?" she said. "Or does he correct you?" The word stung. "He's supportive." Nina didn't push. She never did. But she watched me closely, like someone waiting for a bruise to surface. The moment that sealed it, the moment I should have listened, came on a quiet Sunday morning. We were in bed, sunlight spilling across the sheets. I was telling Elliot about an opportunity I'd been offered, one that excited me, scared me, challenged me. He listened, nodding slowly. Then he said, "I don't think it's right for you. Not right now, not maybe later. Just not right." "Why?" I asked. "It's too exposed," he said. "You thrive in controlled environments." I laughed, assuming he was joking. He was. "You've always been more comfortable when you're guided," he continued. "That's not a bad thing." Something cold settled in my chest. "I'm not sure that's true," I said carefully. He frowned just slightly. "You don't see yourself the way others do." There it was again. That quiet assertion that my self-knowledge was incomplete, that my understanding of myself required his translation. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I told myself he was being protective, that maybe he knew me better than I knew myself, that relationships required trust even when it felt uncomfortable. That was the second lie. The truth is, discomfort is not always a warning. But when it repeats, when it patterns itself around one person's certainty, it deserves attention. I didn't give it that. Instead, I leaned in. I trusted harder, listened more, adjusted further. Because the version of me he met believed that love meant growth, and that growth was supposed to feel destabilizing sometimes. She didn't yet know the difference between expansion and erosion. She didn't realize that by the time a lie feels obvious, it's usually been rehearsed for a while. And that the most dangerous lies are the ones you help tell. There's a specific kind of loneliness that only comes from not being believed. It doesn't arrive as isolation right away. It arrives as doubt, quiet, creeping doubt that slips into conversations, pauses in rooms, sideways glances you pretend not to notice. It feels like being slightly out of sync with the world, like everyone else received a memo you somehow missed. The shift was gradual. That's how Elliot worked. It started with small exclusions. Meetings I used to be invited to that suddenly happened without me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Plans made last minute that somehow always excluded my schedule. When I asked, Elliot had explanations ready. "They assumed you were busy. It was a quick thing, nothing important. I didn't want to overwhelm you." Always reasonable, always calm. I wanted to believe him. The first time I felt openly undermined was at a professional mixer, a familiar environment, one where I'd always felt competent. I was mid-conversation with someone I respected when Elliot joined us, smiling easily. "Mara was just explaining her concerns," he said casually, "but she tends to overthink these things." The words landed softly, almost affectionate. The other person laughed politely. "Don't we all?" But I felt something inside me fracture. I hadn't been overthinking. I'd been articulating a strategy. I looked at Elliot, expecting a glance, a signal that he hadn't meant it that way. He met my eyes unbothered. Later, I brought it up. Quietly, carefully. "You didn't have to frame it like that." He sighed, not dramatically, just enough to convey patience being tested. "I was diffusing tension," he said. "You were getting intense." I was. He tilted his head. "See, this is what I mean." That sentence followed me for days. "This is what I mean." Mean about what? My tone? My reactions? My reality? I started noticing how people reacted to me after spending time with him. How they spoke slower, simpler, like they were choosing their words carefully around something fragile. Once, someone said, "Elliot mentioned you've been under a lot of stress." I hadn't been, not until he said that. The most painful part wasn't the distancing. It was the way Elliot positioned himself as my translator. "She didn't mean it like that. She's passionate, sometimes to a fault. She takes things personally." Each comment chipped away at the credibility of my voice, replacing it with his interpretation. And because he sounded kind, people trusted him. I tried to correct it once, gently. "That's not how I see it," I said in a group conversation when he rephrased something I'd said earlier. The room went quiet. Elliot looked surprised. "Hurt even?" "Oh," he said softly. "I was just trying to help." The silence thickened. Someone changed the subject. Later, he told me I'd embarrassed him. "I didn't contradict you publicly," I said. "You implied I misrepresented you," he replied. "That puts people in an uncomfortable position." I apologized. That night, I cried quietly in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear. I didn't recognize myself anymore. Nina did. "You're shrinking," she said bluntly one evening. after watching me rehearse a text for 5 minutes before sending it. "I'm just being thoughtful." "No," she said, "you're being careful." The word hit hard. Careful around someone who claimed to love me. I started pulling away, not dramatically, not enough to provoke confrontation, just small withdrawals, less talking, less sharing, less correcting. That's when the narrative solidified. Elliot filled the silence. "She's been distant lately. I think she's overwhelmed. I'm worried about her." Concern again, always concern. When people asked me if I was okay, their voices carried an assumption, like the answer was already decided. Once, after I declined an invitation, someone said, "Elliot mentioned you might not be up for social stuff right now." I stared at my phone long after the message ended. I hadn't told him that. The realization came slowly, then all at once. He wasn't reacting to my behavior. He was shaping how it was perceived. And by the time I noticed, the room had already decided who to believe. I tried to talk to him about it, really talk. "I feel like people don't hear me anymore," I said one night. "Like my words don't land the way they used to." He looked at me with something close to pity. "That's because you're too close to it," he said. "You can't see yourself clearly right now." There it was again, the quiet invalidation disguised as insight. "I see myself just fine," I said. He smiled sadly. "That's what scares me." Something in me went still. That was the moment I stopped trying to explain, not because I gave up, but because I understood. This wasn't misunderstanding, it was positioning, and I was losing. The next few weeks passed in a haze. I moved through rooms like a shadow. People were polite, distant, careful. Elliot, meanwhile, was attentive, gentle, publicly devoted. He'd place a hand on my back in group settings, check in on me loudly enough for others to hear. "Let me know if this is too much for you," he'd say. I nodded, numb. I realized then how effective his strategy was. If I protested, I'd confirm the narrative. If I stayed quiet, it would solidify anyway. There was no winning inside his version of events. That night, alone in bed while he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Clarity, not the sharp kind, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't rush. The kind that waits. I understood then that explaining myself wouldn't save me, but leaving without trying to reclaim the story might. I didn't know how yet. I only knew one thing. Everyone had taken his side. And that meant if I wanted myself back, I'd have to stop asking for permission. The day I stopped explaining myself didn't come with an argument. There was no shouting, no dramatic walkout, no line in the sand that anyone else could point to later and say, "That's when it changed." It happened quietly. Internally, the way real shifts always do. I remember the exact moment because of how ordinary it was. We were sitting at Elliot's dining table, laptops open, pretending to work side by side. He was typing emails with that calm efficiency people admired. I was rereading the same paragraph for the 4th time, my mind snagging on something he'd said earlier. "She didn't take it well," he'd told someone on the phone, "but I think she's processing." He hadn't asked me how I was processing anything. When he hung up, I waited. Not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to see if he'd noticed the silence. He didn't. Instead, he glanced over and said, "You okay?" The question felt procedural. "I didn't like how you framed that," I said carefully. "You made it sound like I was unstable." He leaned back in his chair, expression neutral. "That's not what I said." "You implied it." "I was giving context," he replied. "People worry when they don't understand behavior." "My behavior doesn't need context," I said. "It needs accuracy." There was a pause, a subtle shift in the air. "I'm trying to help you," he said, slower now, "but you're making this adversarial." That word, adversarial, hung between us. "I'm just asking you not to speak for me." He sighed. "Myra, you're too close to this. You're emotional." Something inside me finally clicked. Not snapped, not broke, aligned. I realized then that no amount of explanation would ever reach him, because misunderstanding me was never the problem. Control was. "I'm not emotional," I said quietly. "I'm observant." He smiled, the kind that used to reassure me. "See, that's what I mean." And just like that, I was done. Not with him, not yet, but with explaining myself. I closed my laptop and stood. "I'm going for a walk." He frowned. "Now?" "Yes." I didn't wait for permission. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner, like my lungs had been working overtime inside his world and were finally catching up. As I walked, I replayed the past months, not with guilt, but with clarity. I saw the pattern clearly now. Every time I defended myself, the narrative tightened. Every explanation became evidence. Silence, I realized, was the only thing he hadn't prepared for. When I returned, he was on the phone again. I passed by without stopping, grabbed my coat, and left the apartment. He didn't follow. That was new. The next few days were an experiment. I stopped correcting him when he misrepresented my feelings, stopped clarifying my intentions to mutual acquaintances, stopped offering context where it wasn't requested. Instead, I listened. And what I heard was telling. Without my constant participation, Elliot's concern began to sound rehearsed, his explanations slightly too polished, his empathy slightly too performative. People noticed, not consciously, not immediately, but the tone shifted. He compensated by being more attentive publicly, more affectionate, more vocal about his care for me. "She's been through a lot," he told someone at dinner. "I just want to make sure she feels supported." I smiled and said nothing. Nina watched me closely. "You're different," she said one evening. "Quieter but not smaller." "I'm tired of defending myself," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "Good." At work, I kept my head down, focused on deliverables. Let my work speak where my words had been filtered. It felt strange at first, like stepping out of a role I'd rehearsed too well, but with each day, something eased. I slept better. I stopped anticipating his reactions. I stopped bracing. Elliot noticed, of course. "You've been distant," he said one night, irritation bleeding through the calm. "I've been busy." "With what?" "My life." He stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "I feel like you're pulling away." I met his gaze steadily. "Do you?" The question unsettled him. "I just want us to communicate," he said. "I agree," I replied. "Communication doesn't require justification." That night he slept on his side of the bed, back turned. I didn't mind. The truth is, explaining myself had been a habit born of hope, the hope that if I found the right words, I'd be understood. But understanding was never the goal. Agreement was. Once I stopped supplying explanations, I took something essential away from him: access. And without access, his narrative began to wobble. I didn't leave yet. I wasn't ready. But I had crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. I no longer needed him to see me clearly. I just needed to see myself. And I did. The version of me he did recognize. By the time Elliot realized, I wasn't coming back to the version of me he knew. It was already too late. Not because I had changed suddenly, but because I had stopped performing familiarity for his comfort. The shift was subtle at first. I rearranged my mornings so I left earlier. I stopped narrating my day to him as if it required approval. I took phone calls in the other room, not out of secrecy, but out of autonomy. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was instructive. He tried to fill it. "You don't laugh the same anymore," he said one night as we ate dinner in front of the television. "I laugh when something's funny," I replied. "That's not what I meant." "I know." He watched me longer than necessary, as if looking for clues. I kept my eyes on the screen. It wasn't avoidance. It was choice. A week later, he suggested we have dinner with his colleagues, an impromptu gathering he framed as casual but planned like a campaign. "They've been asking about—" There was a pause. Elliot laughed softly. "She's modest." I met his eyes, held them. "I'm precise," I said. The table shifted uncomfortably. Later in the car, he was quiet for a long time. Then, "You embarrassed me." I waited. "You contradicted me." I corrected the record. "That's the same thing." "It's not." He exhaled sharply. "You could have handled that differently." "How?" "You know, so it didn't sound like I was lying." I wasn't responsible for how it sounded. That was the moment I saw it clearly. The version of me he needed was one that smoothed his edges. That absorbed his framing. That translated his intent into something palatable. That version was gone. "You're being difficult," he said. "I'm being honest." "About what?" "About myself." He shook his head, frustrated. "You're acting like this is some power struggle." "It's not," I said. "It's a boundary." That word again, boundary. He hated it. Boundaries implied limits. Limits implied loss. He didn't speak to me the rest of the drive. At home, he went straight to his office. I didn't follow. Instead, I sat on the couch and let myself feel the unfamiliar calm of not fixing anything. The next morning, Nina texted me, "Coffee, I want to see your face." We met at our usual place, the one with chipped mugs and no pretense. She studied me as I sat down. "You look lighter," she said, "and sharper." "I feel clearer." "Good, because Elliot's been calling me." I raised an eyebrow. About what? Concern, she said flatly. He wants to know if you're okay, if you've said anything to me, if I've noticed changes. And what did you say? I said you seem fine. More yourself, actually. A smile tugged at my mouth. How did he take that? He didn't. We both laughed quietly. Later that day, I took a risk I'd been postponing. I scheduled a meeting with my supervisor and pitched a project I'd been developing privately. No preface, no apology, just the idea presented cleanly. She listened, asked questions, took notes. I don't know why you haven't brought this up before, she said. I did. I knew exactly why. When I told Elliot about the meeting that evening, his reaction was immediate. You went to her without telling me. I wasn't asking permission. I could have helped you prepare. I was prepared. He frowned. You're shutting me out. I'm letting myself in. He stared at me, something like disbelief crossing his face. You think you can just redefine things. I already have. The truth was I had stopped seeking recognition from him, and without that need, his influence weakened. He tried new tactics after that. Concern gave way to nostalgia. He brought up old memories, inside jokes, trips we'd taken. He reminded me, subtly, of who I used to be. But memory isn't leverage when it's no longer currency. One night, as we brushed our teeth side by side, he said, I miss us. I met my reflection, then his. Which version? He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. The version of me he missed was the one who explained herself until she disappeared inside the explanation. The one who made room for his certainty by shrinking her own. I rinsed my toothbrush and walked away. That was the night I began planning, not an exit, not yet, but a future where my voice didn't need translation. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what he'd say when he realized. Because I already knew, the cost of clarity. Clarity doesn't arrive like relief. It arrives like a bill. I felt it the morning Elliot didn't say goodbye. We moved around each other in the kitchen with the choreography of people who knew every step and refused to acknowledge the music had stopped. He made coffee, I packed my bag, our elbows nearly touched. They didn't. He glanced at the clock, then at his phone. I'll be late tonight, he said, already halfway gone. Okay. The word landed heavier than it should have. He paused, just for a fraction of a second, as if waiting for something else, an objection, a question, a negotiation. When none came, he nodded and left. The door clicked shut, and the apartment felt different. Not emptier. Quieter in a way that let sound exist again. The hum of the fridge, the distant traffic, my own breathing. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the stillness settle. This was the cost of clarity. Fewer words, fewer assurances, fewer rituals pretending to mean something they no longer did. At work, the momentum from my meeting last week hadn't faded. My supervisor followed up with questions, then a calendar invite. Suddenly, the project I'd nurtured in private was being discussed in rooms I'd once been invited into only as support. I spoke carefully, but I didn't soften my ideas. I watched how people listened when I didn't preface every statement with doubt. They leaned in. During lunch, Nina called. So, she said, skipping pleasantries. He called me again. I sighed, what now? He asked if you're seeing someone. I almost laughed. No. That's what I told him. Did he believe you? No. There it was, the familiar assumption that my growth must be borrowed, that any confidence had to come from somewhere else. Preferably someone else. He also asked if you're angry with him, Nina added. Am I? Are you? I thought about it, about the absence of shouting, of slammed doors, of accusations. No, I said slowly. I'm just done explaining myself. That's worse for him. I know. That night, Elliot came home later than usual. His jacket smelled like a bar, old wood, citrus cleaner, something sharp underneath. He dropped his keys louder than necessary. We ate separately, not out of conflict, out of distance. Finally, he sat across from me, elbows on the table, fingers laced together like a plea he hadn't spoken yet. Do you still want this? He asked. The question wasn't about us. It was about control, about whether the narrative could still be steered back into familiar lanes. I want honesty, I said. He frowned. That's not an answer. It is, you just don't like where it leads. He leaned back, studying me. You're different. Yes. You don't check in anymore. I check in with myself. He scoffed. That's selfish. No, I said calmly. It's adult. Silence stretched between us, thick and fragile. I feel like you're pulling away, he said. I am. There it was. Not an accusation, a fact. And you're okay with that? he asked. I considered the question carefully because this was the moment he'd later remember, the point where he'd say everything changed. I'm okay with becoming someone I recognize, I said. He looked at me like I'd spoken a language he didn't know. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, but from awareness. I noticed every sound he made as he shifted beside me. The distance between our bodies felt deliberate now. In the early hours, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The next day, I told him I needed space. Not a break, not an ultimatum, space. He reacted exactly as I expected, first with reason, then with emotion, then with nostalgia. We can fix this, he said. We've been through worse. We've survived worse, I corrected. That's not the same. You're giving up. I'm choosing myself. He shook his head, voice tight. You didn't used to talk like this. I didn't used to know better. That stung him, I saw it land. Where would you even go? He asked. I'll figure it out. You don't have a plan. I have clarity. He laughed bitterly. That's not enough. It is for me. I packed a bag that afternoon. Not everything, just what I needed. Clothes, laptop, a book I hadn't finished. The essentials of a life in motion. As I zipped the bag, he stood in the doorway, watching like a spectator to a play he didn't believe was real. You'll come back, he said. I met his gaze. I don't know. That was the most honest thing I could give him. Nina let me crash on her couch. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a mug of tea and an extra blanket. Later, lying awake in her living room, I felt the weight of what I'd done settle in my chest. Not regret, responsibility. I had chosen clarity over comfort, and clarity demanded follow-through. In the quiet, I realized something else too. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the point where it stopped being written for me. And whatever came next would cost me something too. But for the first time, I was willing to pay. Learning the shape of silence. Silence has a shape. I learned that during my first full week away from Elliot, sleeping on Nina's couch, brushing my teeth with a borrowed toothbrush, and waking up each morning unsure whether the tightness in my chest was grief or freedom. It changed depending on the hour. Mornings were the hardest. Habit pulled me awake before my alarm, my body expecting the familiar rhythm of another person beside me. I'd lie still for a moment, disoriented, listening to the quiet. No breathing that wasn't my own, no weight on the mattress, no low hum of someone else's presence grounding me. The silence then felt sharp, like cold air in my lungs, but by afternoon, it softened, became spacious. I could think without editing myself. I could work without glancing at my phone, wondering if I'd missed something important or something passive-aggressive disguised as concern. Work became my anchor. I stayed late not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The office after hours felt honest. No performative productivity, just the glow of desk lamps and the quiet tapping of keys. I made progress, real progress, the kind that builds instead of patches over cracks. One evening, as I packed up my bag, my supervisor stopped by my desk. You've been focused lately, she said, not accusing, observing. I've had fewer distractions. She smiled knowingly. Sometimes clarity does that. The word followed me home. Clarity. It still felt new in my mouth, like a language I was only beginning to learn. Elliot texted on the 4th day. Can we talk? I stared at the message longer than necessary, noticing how my body reacted before my mind did. No spike of panic, no rush of obligation, just a quiet assessment. About what? I typed back. There was a pause, I sighed softly. Of course, I don't think there's anything new to say right now. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. You left without finishing the conversation. I closed my eyes. This was familiar terrain, the reframing of boundaries as abandonment. I didn't leave the conversation, I replied carefully. I left the cycle. That ended the exchange. For now, Nina didn't comment when she saw me staring at my phone. She just handed me a glass of water and nudged my foot with hers. You're allowed to take your time, she said. I know. You don't look like you know. I'm learning. That night I dreamed of our apartment, but it wasn't the way it really looked. The walls were bare, the furniture gone. Just me standing in the middle of an empty room, holding a door that wouldn't close no matter how hard I pushed. I woke up before I could figure out what it meant. On the weekend, I went back to the apartment to collect more of my things. Elliot wasn't there. He'd texted to say he'd be out all day, the words loaded with implication. The space felt smaller without him, or maybe I was just seeing it clearly for the first time. I packed methodically. Clothes first. Books. The framed photo we'd once argued about hanging, because he said it made the place feel too permanent. I left it on the shelf. In the bedroom, I paused by the dresser, my fingers resting on the edge like it might anchor me. This was where we'd stood during our last real fight, where I'd raised my voice and immediately apologized for it. I didn't apologize now, I just breathed. As I zipped my second bag, my phone buzzed. Elliot, you didn't tell me you were coming today. You told me you'd be out, I replied. Another pause. I could come back, please don't. That response felt like crossing a line, but not the kind that traps you. The kind that finally shows you where you stand. I left the key on the counter when I walked out. That night, sitting on Nina's balcony with the city lights flickering below, I felt something unexpected rise up through the quiet. Grief. Not for Elliot exactly, but for the version of myself who had stayed longer than she should have, who had believed that endurance was the same as love. The tears came without drama. Just steady, honest release. Nina didn't interrupt. She just sat beside me, shoulder to shoulder, present without trying to fix anything. I don't hate him, I said finally. You don't have to. I just don't want to shrink again. She nodded, then don't. The following week brought more changes. I signed a short-term lease on a small studio, nothing fancy, but mine. I bought cheap furniture and arranged it exactly how I liked, without negotiating aesthetics or apologizing for preferences. Every choice felt radical. Elliot tried again after I moved. This time, he showed up at my building. I saw him through the lobby doors before I heard my phone ring. His posture was familiar, hands in pockets, jaw tight, rehearsing something that sounded better in his head. I didn't invite him up. We stood outside instead, the city moving around us like we were stationary objects in its path. You're really doing this, he said. Yes. You didn't even try to fix it. I met his eyes. I tried for years. That's not fair. No, I agreed. It's accurate. He exhaled sharply, frustration cracking through his composure. So that's it. I considered him. The man I'd loved. The man I'd outgrown. The man still trying to understand how control had slipped through his fingers. For now, I said, yes. He looked like he wanted to argue, then like he wanted to beg. Instead, he nodded once, stiff and wounded. Good luck, he said, the words edged with something unreadable. Thank you, I replied, and meant it. That night, alone in my new apartment, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and listened to the silence again. It had changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't empty. It was open. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might fill it next. By the time the quiet settled into my bones, I stopped mistaking it for loneliness. It was something else entirely. Space. Space to notice the way my thoughts arrived without interruption. Space to feel anger without rushing to soften it. Space to want things again, even if I didn't know yet what they were. My studio began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a declaration. I added small details that felt indulgent. A plant I kept alive longer than expected, a soft lamp that turned the evenings golden, a corkboard above my desk where I pinned fragments of myself, ticket stubs, notes, a list titled things I'm allowed to want. I hadn't filled the list yet, but seeing the title every morning felt like progress. Work accelerated in a way that surprised me. With the noise gone, I finished projects early. I spoke up in meetings without rehearsing my tone. I disagreed when something didn't sit right. The confidence felt borrowed at first, like a jacket that didn't quite fit, but each day it warmed to my shape. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, clarity arrived with teeth. I was halfway through a report when an anonymous message appeared on my phone. No name attached, just words carefully written. I think you deserve to know the truth. I froze. The message didn't explain itself immediately, leaving a pause that felt heavy. I didn't sit down. I didn't pace. I stayed exactly where I was, one hand resting on the edge of my desk, grounding myself in the present. I'm listening, I typed back. The next message arrived after a long pause. It detailed Elliot's betrayal, late messages, hidden meetings, and misrepresentations over the months. Nothing sensational, just the careful facts I had a right to know, framed without bias or commentary. The sender made it clear. The truth was coming from a source that valued honesty, not drama. I closed my eyes, not in pain. In recognition, I'd suspected as much, pieced it together from his behavior and inconsistencies. Still, having confirmation landed heavily. "Thank you," I replied and meant it, for telling me. After I hung up, or rather, after the message thread ended, I stood in the quiet office, the hum of fluorescent lights suddenly too loud. The truth didn't shatter me. It didn't even surprise me. What it did was rearrange everything. I left work early and walked home instead of taking the train. I needed the movement, the rhythm of my feet against the pavement to anchor me in my body. With each step, pieces of the past clicked into place. The late nights, the defensiveness, the way Elliot had accused me of being distant while carefully cultivating distance himself. It wasn't just emotional negligence, it was deliberate deception. By the time I reached my building, my anger had cooled into something sharper and more focused. Not rage, resolve. Elliot texted that evening. "Can we talk? I feel like we left things unfinished." I stared at the message, thinking of the carefully worded truth I had received, of the way honesty had found me without asking permission. "I know about everything," I typed. The response was immediate. "Everything?" I waited before replying, letting the silence do some of the work. "Yes." Another pause, longer. He was recalculating. I could almost hear the gears turning, the familiar attempt to manage the narrative. "It wasn't what you think." There it was, the opening line of every excuse he'd ever given. "It was exactly what I think," I wrote. "You lied." Repeatedly. "I was confused," he replied. "We were in a bad place." I sat down on the floor, back against the couch, phone heavy in my hand. "Being unhappy doesn't give you permission to betray someone," I said. "And being confused doesn't excuse being cruel." The typing dots appeared and disappeared, a stuttering reflection of his uncertainty. "I never meant to hurt you," I exhaled slowly. Intent doesn't erase impact. That ended the conversation. Not with drama, not with threats. With a boundary he couldn't negotiate his way around. Later, Nina came over with takeout and an unspoken understanding that something had shifted. "You look different," she said after a moment. "I feel different." Good different or world is on fire different. I smiled faintly, clear different. I told her about the anonymous message, about the betrayal, about the way truth had finally filled in the gaps. Nina listened, jaw tight, eyes steady. "I'm proud of you," she said when I finished. "For what?" "For not running back to explain your pain to the person who caused it." That night, alone again, I revisited the corkboard. I added a new note beneath the list title. "I am allowed to leave when honesty disappears." Sleep came easily. In the days that followed, Elliot went quiet. No texts, no surprise appearances. The absence felt intentional this time, not avoidance but surrender. And that scared me more than his persistence ever had, because now there was nothing left to push against. I filled the space carefully. I signed up for a class I'd always wanted to take but never had time for. I met Nina for coffee without discussing Elliot even once. I laughed more easily. I cried less often. But at night, questions crept in. What else had I known? What truths had I accepted simply because they were easier than digging deeper? One evening, as I sorted through a box of old papers, I found something I'd forgotten entirely. A lease addendum from 2 years ago, unsigned by me, detailing a sublet agreement for a room I'd never seen. My name wasn't on it. Elliot's was. The date made my stomach drop. The truth, it seemed, wasn't finished with me yet. Picking up the pieces. The first morning in my new studio, I woke up to the sunlight spilling across the floor. It hit every corner differently than in Elliot's apartment. There were no shadows of arguments, no traces of unspoken expectations, just clean angles of light and my own breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the quiet, feeling myself. It was still strange, walking alone through a space that belonged entirely to me. Even after weeks of living on my own, the idea of autonomy still felt like a discovery. I made coffee slowly, letting the aroma wake my senses. I didn't check my phone immediately. No messages, no excuses, no half-truths, just the hum of the city beneath my window and the warmth in my hands from the mug. I reviewed my notes for the upcoming project at work, and for the first time, I didn't feel any pressure to temper my ideas for anyone's comfort. I was contributing purely because I wanted to, because I could, because I had clarity now. The truth I'd uncovered, about Elliot, about myself, about boundaries, had made room for something new, something I could shape without fear. During lunch, Nina came over. She walked in with her usual calm energy, carrying a small bag of groceries, but the way she looked at me, I could tell she knew today felt different. "You seem lighter," she said, setting the bags on the counter. "I think I am," I admitted. "I feel whole, in a way I didn't think was possible before." She smiled and handed me an orange from the bag. "Good, you've earned it." We spent the afternoon unpacking a few boxes I hadn't touched since moving. Books, papers, small mementos I wanted to display. Each object I placed felt symbolic, a tiny assertion of self. A notebook with scribbled dreams went on the corkboard. A small sculpture from a gallery trip found a home on the shelf. Every little detail reminded me that I was allowed to exist on my own terms. That evening, I decided to take a walk. The streets were alive with the low hum of traffic and people heading home. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was looking for Elliot's shadow in every stranger's face. I walked deliberately, noticing storefronts, laughing children, stray cats weaving between parked cars. The world was full and I was present in it. A familiar buzz on my phone startled me. "Elliot, can we talk, please?" I stared at the screen, letting the 3 words hang in the air. My first instinct wasn't panic, it was evaluation. What had he learned? What did he want now? And most importantly, how would this conversation serve me? I typed carefully, "There's nothing more to discuss. I'm moving forward." The response was delayed. When it finally came, it read, "I never wanted to hurt you. I was wrong." I exhaled slowly. The apology was hollow, familiar, and yet strangely impotent. Words without actions. I hadn't expected anything different. Acknowledged, I replied, no further response. The silence that followed felt final, the weight of it grounding me instead of frightening me. Later, at home, I reflected on the weeks that had passed. The growth I had made, the independence I had claimed, felt monumental. Yet I realized something: I couldn't completely ignore the pain. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was evidence of my resilience. The hurt reminded me that I'd survived, that I'd learned, that I had not given up. That night, I sat on the floor with my legs crossed, surrounded by the items I'd unpacked. I wrote a letter to myself, not for anyone else to read, just for me. I acknowledged the truth of my past with Elliot, the complexity of my emotions, and the resolve I now carried. Writing the words gave them weight, permanence, and a sense of ceremony. "I am allowed to love myself without apology," I wrote. "I am allowed to leave when honesty disappears. I am allowed to define my own happiness." The next morning, I woke with a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The city was still bustling, still noisy, still chaotic, but it no longer affected the equilibrium I had carved out. My independence wasn't fragile. It was lived in, seasoned, and real. Work called me into a meeting that afternoon. I presented my ideas with clarity, precision, and confidence. Colleagues listened attentively, and for once, there was no undercurrent of doubt or tension, just recognition. I realized in that moment that my strength didn't come from being right or liked. It came from being authentic, unapologetically myself. After work, I met Nina for coffee. We didn't talk about Elliot. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about mundane things: the new cafe opening down the street, books we wanted to read, plans for a weekend hike. It was liberating. Conversations no longer revolved around repairing or explaining my life. They revolved around living it. That night, I prepared dinner for myself, carefully plating each element. I ate slowly, savoring the flavor, the independence, the peace that had settled in. I realized that happiness wasn't a single event, it was the sum of small decisions made consistently over time. Choosing myself, choosing honesty, choosing presence. After dinner, I went to my corkboard. I added another note beneath the previous ones: "I am learning to be enough on my own." I looked around my studio, at the small but tangible manifestations of autonomy, and I felt a quiet pride. Not the pride of conquest or vengeance, but the pride of survival, clarity, and self-respect. As sleep crept in, I knew the future was uncertain. There would be challenges, unexpected moments, perhaps even remnants of old patterns trying to creep back in. But I felt ready, not fearless but aware, not unbroken but unbowed. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like possibility, the quiet that lasts. The sunlight poured in through the wide studio window, scattering across the hardwood floor and warming the edges of my new home. I had learned by now that mornings carried a different weight than they used to. No shadows from Elliot, no sense of impending confrontation, no restless heartbeats waiting for a message or a knock at the door. Just the gentle rhythm of my own life, unfolding quietly without apology. I made coffee and sat on the floor, back against the wall, the mug warm in my hands. Around me, the little universe I had carved out gleamed in soft morning light. My book stacked just so, my corkboard littered with notes and tickets and reminders of myself, the plant thriving in its corner, and a small framed photo of my parents I had rescued from the old apartment. It was not extravagant, but it was mine. Every object, every choice, every inch of space belonged to me. There was a message on my phone, but I didn't check it immediately. I didn't need to. Part of me wanted to keep it there, a reminder that life moved on around me even when I chose not to engage. When I finally looked, it was from Nina. Coffee later, I smiled and typed back, "Yes, see you at 3." The morning passed in deliberate calm. I reviewed work notes, made a plan for the week, and even allowed myself some idle time to read. The quiet was not lonely. It was a companion now, a teacher. I had discovered its shape and found comfort in it. By the time I met Nina at the cafe, I felt fully present. She greeted me with that warm, knowing smile, the one that had become my constant over the past months. "You're glowing," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I'm not sure it's glowing," I said, smiling. "It's more steady." "That's better than glowing," she replied. "It lasts longer." We talked about mundane things, books, work projects, the city. We laughed easily, without the tension of old conversations that had always revolved around Elliot. It felt effortless, as if the weight I had carried for years had finally lifted, leaving space for real connection, not negotiation. Walking home afterward, I passed a couple arguing outside a restaurant. I felt a pang of empathy, not judgment. I knew that pain intimately, but I also knew it didn't have to define me. I had learned that love could exist without self-erasure, that respect and honesty were not optional, and that leaving a situation that no longer served me was an act of courage, not failure. At home, I unpacked the last of my boxes. There were small remnants of my past, old journals, keepsakes, photographs, but I arranged them in a way that honored memory without allowing it to dominate. I had made peace with what had been, and in doing so, cleared a path to what could be. That evening, I decided to write again. Not letters, not lists, not reminders. I wrote a story. It was unfinished and raw, but it was my own. Words flowed without fear of judgment or interruption. Each sentence felt like a declaration. I existed, I mattered, I could create freely. As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the room in amber light, I paused and looked at my reflection in the window. The face staring back was familiar, yet unfamiliar. Stronger, softer, older but not burdened. I had endured the storm of deceit, confusion, and heartbreak, and I had emerged intact. Perhaps not whole in the naive sense, but whole in the sense that mattered. Intact, aware, and ready. Later that night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, the city lights twinkling outside like a distant galaxy. I reflected on the journey. The arguments that had once seemed insurmountable, the betrayals that had felt like permanent cracks, the nights of silent despair. All of it had shaped me, but none of it defined the person I had become. I realized that strength was not absence of vulnerability, but the ability to navigate it, to hold space for grief and hope in equal measure. A soft knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, no one was there, just a small envelope on the welcome mat. I picked it up carefully, noting the lack of a return address. Inside was a simple note in neat handwriting, "Keep going. You're doing better than you know." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't anticipated. The message was anonymous, yet it resonated deeply. Life had a way of sending reminders that even the smallest acknowledgments, sometimes from strangers, sometimes from the universe itself, could affirm your path. I placed the note on the corkboard next to my other reminders. It fit perfectly, a small, quiet validation of progress, courage, and persistence. That night, I crawled into bed with a sense of closure. Not finality, the world was still unpredictable, but a sense of balance, of knowing I could face whatever came next. I understood now that independence did not mean isolation. It meant clarity. It meant choosing relationships that nurtured rather than diminished.